Hello, my name is Roger Berkowitz, and welcome to the next session of the Hannah Arendt Center virtual reading group. Today we are reading Hannah Arendt's essay, The Concept of History, Ancient and Modern. It's published in her book, Between Past and the Future, which we've been reading. This is the second essay in the book. It's a complicated essay. It's one of the longer essays that she writes, and we're going to try and make sense of it. The best way to begin and to get a grasp of this essay is to look at the subtitle, Ancient and Modern. Arendt opposes two ideas of history, or the concept of history, an ancient idea and a modern idea. The ancient idea of history addresses singular events, deeds, words, specifically great deeds and words. So on page 42, she writes, in ancient history, the stress is always on single instances and single gestures. The subject matter of history is these interruptions, the extraordinary. So history is about those extraordinary events that break up the flow of time, the deeds of people. And she writes and continues on page 44 that the task of the historiographer, the historian, is to make something lasting out of remembrance, to remember the great deeds, to ennoble them. This is what both poets and historians do, and give them a kind of immortality. The point is that for the Greeks and even for the Romans in a different way, nature was immortal. It continues. Animals live in a cycle of life. They last forever. The stars above last forever. It is humans that are mortal and that die and live a fleeting and potentially meaningless life and existence. And the way that humans can become immortal is by doing great deeds and having those great deeds remembered in poetry, art, and history. And so she'll write on page 48 that the concern with greatness, so prominent in Greek poetry and historiography, is based on the most intimate connection between the concepts of nature and history. Nature being immortal, history being the remembrance and immortalizing of man. She continues, their common denominator is immortality. History receives into remembrance those mortals who through deed and word have proved themselves worthy of nature, and their everlasting fame means that they, despite their mortality, may remain in the company of the things that last forever. In other words, history makes men natural, immortal. That's the Greek or the ancient, and to a certain extent also the Roman view of history. In the modern age, Arendt argues, history changes, emerges as something else. This relates to our loss of the idea of immortality for both nature and man. And history ceases to be about singular deeds and words and even the sufferings of men. She says on page 58, it was no longer composed of the deeds and sufferings of men, and it no longer told the story of events affecting the lives of men. And here's the key line. History became a man-made process, the only all-comprehending process which owed its existence exclusively to the human race. She'll repeat on page 63, the modern concept of process, pervading history and nature alike, separates the modern age from the past more profoundly than any other single idea. This is a core thought in nearly all of Arendt's writing in the 1950s, the emergence of the idea of process. In the last chapter on the Vita Activa and the modern age, in the human condition, the role of process is determinative in Arendt's thinking about the modern age. And she goes on at length in this essay as well about this idea of process. Both nature and history become processes. And so whereas for the Greeks and the Romans in the ancient idea of history, human actions were opposed to nature, and nature was immortal, and human actions had to be immortalized when they deserved to be by poets and historians. In the modern era, modern age, we should say, for Arendt, both nature and history become a process. So what is a process? It's the idea here is that there is no true, knowable, objective, impartial reality or truth, and all we have are processes that are started. We act, and action becomes, in the modern age, determinative of the human condition, but also of the world. We can act into the world with nuclear fission and nuclear fusion and remake the world and start new processes that will become natural, and in doing so change nature, so that nature is no longer something static and immortal and everlasting, but something that human processes, human actions can input and impact. This means that for Arendt, the rise of action and technology in which we enact in the world, in a sense, connects nature and history in a way that had never been seen before. Both become subject to human action that can begin processes that these processes are what actually determine and have impact in the world. Within the realm of history and the concept of history, for Arendt, this means that there's a loss of objectivity in both, by the way, history and the natural sciences. And she talks a bit about the natural sciences here and in other essays. And the premise is that insofar as we now seek to know the world of nature through experiments which humans enact and create, the way we know nature is increasingly determined through human framing, and that which is not to say that the experiments we do aren't objective in some way, they are scientific, but they are always framed by the questions we ask and the experiments we create to investigate those hypotheses and questions, and thus nature increasingly takes on a mirror-like gaze, and nature, as I think Werner Heisenberg said, and Arendt quotes, in seeking to understand nature, we seek to understand and know ourselves, because we frame the way we see and know nature. What this means in history is that we increasingly see the world through our eyes, our perspective, and we lose not only objectivity, which was always a false idol, but more importantly for Arendt, impartiality. The true art of Greek and Roman and ancient history for her is not objectivity, it's impartiality. It's that we look at the world and look at those great deeds, and we tell those great deeds and celebrate those great deeds, even if they're not done by our friends. And so Homer tells the greatness of the Trojans and of Hector, just as he tells the greatness of the Greeks and Achilles. And it's this great impartiality, this Greek impartiality, which she sees as central to the Greek idea of politics, namely that the world we have in common, this is what she writes on page 51, is regarded from an infinite number of different standpoints to which correspond the most diverse points of view. in an impartial historical framework, we can understand and even credit infinitely diverse points of view because we recognize them as great, as meaningful, because greatness and meaning have a sense on their own, something that is no longer the case today. The rise of doubt with Descartes, subjectivization, internalization, means what she calls world alienation. Again, this is an idea discussed at length in her book, The Human Condition, primarily in that last chapter, The Vita Activa and the Modern Age. As taste emerges as the standard, there is no true greatness, there's just taste or preference. There is no necessary historical events, there's nothing truly worthy of being remembered. History is simply one process we tell, and we can tell many others. And what we tell is not driven by the greatness of the events of history, but by its usefulness. And so history becomes not something that is objective or impartial, but itself is a technology. It is a means to an end. It is something we wield to achieve our ends. And so she can write on page 88 that the historian looks back into history and seeks to bring meaning and coherence, and here's the quote, independent of the aims and awareness of the actors, so that he is liable to overlook what actually happened in his attempt to discern some objective trend. The historian doesn't actually care so much about what happened, the facts, the reality, the truth, but seeks some trend that is meaningful or useful. And so the historian becomes like a scientist, someone who creates history, makes history, starts a process, names a process that will be meaningful and useful in the world. And so Arendt can say on page 58, that today historians make history just as scientists make nature. And this is again part of her argument that history and science merge together in the modern age and form a common idea of a technology that we use to make and impact our world. Just as today man can start natural processes, we can start historical processes, create history. And if that is so, she says, it's understandable why we devalue history and the humanities. Insofar as we have taken, she writes on page 60, we have taken nature into the human world as such and obliterated the defensive boundaries between the natural elements and the human artifice by which all previous civilizations were hedged in. Why study history when it's not there? It's what we make. And if it's what we make, it's more important to make it than to study it. And this is the reason she says that history as an academic discipline, but also as something of interest to people, will decline and is declining in the modern age. I think, and this is again on page 58 where she says that. On page 63, she'll continue and she'll write, for the first time in our history, the human capacity for action has begun to dominate all others. And that's what I've been saying, which is that insofar as we act into the world and create new processes, start new trends and lines, we can remake the physical, natural, historical, meaningful world. And so action comes to dominate all other processes, or capacities for action. And she continues, the capacity for wonder and thought are dominated by action, no less than the capacities for making, homo faber, and for laboring, anima laborans. And the result of this is that it is beyond doubt, she writes, that this capacity to act is the most dangerous of all human abilities and possibilities. Action is dangerous because we can remake the world, change it, alter it, and the world becomes our plaything, our thing that we can alter and remake. And this brings us to the epilogue, 4 or 5 pages of the epilogue, which are just rich and really bring this, I have to admit, somewhat disorganized and confusing essay together. And it's important to, when you're reading this essay, maybe even read the epilogue first to get a sense of how it all coheres and unites. But in the epilogue, she'll write on page 89 to 90, in the situation of radical world alienation, neither history nor nature is at all conceivable. Let that sink in. In the situation of radical world alienation, when the world has become subjectivized, internalized, doubted, there is no Ding an sich for Kant. There's no thing in itself. For Descartes, there's doubt. And that true judgments are become, as what Kant calls, judgments of taste, preference. History is not an objective set of facts or objective timeline. Nature is not something that exists immortally. Both history and nature can become remade, impacted by human action. And that is a deeply unsettling world where man can not only, it's, the idea that anything is permitted, which is the moral conclusion of 19th century nihilism, is now replaced by the motto of totalitarianism, which is not that anything is permitted, but anything is possible. That's an extraordinary shift. We can make the world differently. Anything is possible. And so she writes on page 87 of the epilogue, what is really undermining the whole modern notion that meaning is contained in the process as a whole. So what undermines the idea that we can create a process with objective meaning is that not only can we prove this, and this is that no question exists at all which does not lead to a consistent set of answers. So we can prove that there is, for any question, a consistent set of answers, which means that we can make the world, insert a falsity, a lie into the world. And once we do so, we can start interpreting the world consistently based on that lie. And in this consistent deduction, she continues, we can take almost any hypothesis and act upon it with a sequence of results in reality which not only make sense, but work. We can functionalize the consistent deductions from a falsity or a lie. And the conclusion, she writes on 87, is this. This means quite literally that everything is possible, not only in the realm of ideas, but in the field of reality itself. We can actually remake reality. And in a world like ours, where propaganda and lies and fake news and falsity can all be used to insert falsities into the world, that when people take them seriously and credit them, begin to become real. Everything is possible, even things that are fake, which we can make real. David Rousseau's famous line that everything is possible is what Arendt chooses as the epigraph to her to the section on totalitarianism in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. And this shows the deep connection between this essay on the concept of history, ancient and modern, and Arendt's thinking about totalitarianism. It also shows, in a way that's often overlooked, the importance of Arendt's discussion of processes and the modern idea of processes in the human condition to her thinking about totalitarianism. And so in this essay on page 87, she writes, totalitarianism's strange disregard for factuality is based, in the last analysis, on the conviction that everything is possible and not just permitted, morally or otherwise, as was the case with early nihilism. The totalitarian systems tend to demonstrate that action can be based on any hypothesis, and that in the course of consistently guided action, the particular hypothesis will become true, will become actual, factual reality. Once again, we can act in such a way on a hypothesis as to make it real, even if it was not true. And she then adds, the hypothesis we act on, the unreal fact, can be, quote, as mad as it pleases. It can be nuts. It can be something like the Jews are the cause of all world corruption. And if we act consistently on that hypothesis, we can make it true. We can make it into facts because we act on it in a way that our actions then become facts that become real and give this mad idea objective reality. And so she concludes, what was originally nothing but a mad hypothesis that could either be proved or disproved by actual facts will, in the course of consistent action, always turn into a fact, never to be disproved. This is the danger that she finds in the modern concept of history as a process. And so she writes on page 89 in the last paragraph of the essay, the modern age, with its growing world alienation, namely that the world has ceased to be something objective and common and shared, and is something increasingly subjectivized that we can make for our own tastes, and thus something we don't share in common with others. This growing world alienation has led to a situation where man, wherever he goes, encounters himself. All the processes of the earth and universe have revealed themselves either as man-made or as potentially man-made. This is referring back to the Heisenberg hypothesis I mentioned earlier, that in both science and history, we now see ourselves in the world we understand. These processes, she concludes, after having devoured, as it were, the solid objectivity of the given, ended by rendering meaningless the one overall process which originally was conceived in order to give meaning to them, and to act, so to speak, as the eternal time-space in which they could all flow, and thus be rid of their mutual conflicts and exclusiveness. This is what happened to our concept of history as it happened to our concept of nature. In the situation of radical world alienation, neither history nor nature is at all conceivable. This is the loss of the common world, which makes history and nature something not conceivable as true, but as technologies that can be manipulated and used to remake our world, which is the foundation of our current world of defactualization, where history and nature can be, in a sense, remade through this dangerous capacity of human action. That is the world that Arendt sees we have entered into. It is the world in which we need to learn to act in a world without banisters. It's where we need to learn to think in the gap between past and future. And I look forward to discussing it with you in our reading group later this week. Thank you very much.